Yat the bet the jene nashle. The kota oyate basha shichi. Ha mitakia bi. Chante washtea na pechi yizapedo. It's good to be here. I come from a place called Minnesota. It was good talking to Tony Alexis yesterday evening. I was over in his community some time ago, met one of their elders who works in their cultural language program. So we shared some stories since they recognized that they came from Minnesota a long time ago. In fact, they call that lake up there, the sacred lake, Dewaka. And so there's a lot of commonality. And I was kind of thinking on what I talk about here. The foundation of our work, I'm the director of the Indigenous Environmental Network. Maybe next slide. And we always go by mandates as Native people. We all have mandates. And it was good listening to the elders speak this morning, because our mandate comes from Unchimaka, from our grandmother Earth. Our mandate comes from the air, from the sky. Our mandates are set into place for those of us that practice and understand those teachings, our original instructions. We call it in many different ways. Those are our mandates on how to live, how to exist, and how to have relations and treat each other. Even the mandate to coming into someone else's village. You bring the Chanduhupa, and the elder this morning talked about that mandate of the pipe, the messages of that stone in Jasper. It reminded me back east. Those faces and those instructions are in the rock outcroppings in the Great Lakes. They're carved there. They're messages of who and how we are to be. Even in the prairie lands at Jeffers petroglyph, they call it. Those teachings are there on those rocks. So we have a lot of similar things that we have, mandates and protocols. Next. So what is our mandate for participating in this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change? That's the framework on a global level when world leaders and environmental organizations, people came together in 1982, was it? The Earth Summit, or 92, was 92. And that's when they said climate change is real. So there was a mandate coming out of there to form that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. For us on the state side, and I don't like to really separate us from the Canada, the medicine line, I always try to break that down. On the state side, we had a meeting like this. It was all spearheaded by the US federal government. They wanted our chiefs and council at that meeting. We're founded from the traditional societies, Indigenous Environmental Network, like the White Clay Society from the Grovons, just right over here in Montana. Traditional societies, spiritual leaders, that's our mandates from our communities. And so we had to push ourselves to be invited to that meeting. Spiritual leaders, youth, women, and our voices from the community. Out of that meeting, it was good because the chiefs and the council had to hear us. Out of that was a recognition of, number one, the creator and the responsibilities of who we are. That we have responsibilities to safeguard the well-being of future generations. Next slide. We talked about prophecies. Before we start talking about the US government and how they were approaching climate change in 1998 as a policy. We had to look at it from our own way. A lot of translation from different people. We were in the territories of the Pueblo people in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. So we talked about prophecies and teachings on how they had foreseen this was going to happen. Oren Lyons from the Onondaga people from the Six Nations, he said they have a prophecy when the trees start drying out from the top down. This was the climate change. They didn't have the word for climate change, but they knew from the nature. and that we have responsibility to live in harmony. Next one. And they said that Western science and technology, that's always there. It's like a shadow, part of our life. Some of our own people have got degrees in Western science, but the foundation is our traditional teachings, and that somehow what the Western science is now saying, we already know. Next. And the continuation of that is that we have an understanding of that relationship to the resources, and that rights has always been the issue. Who has rights to the land, whether it's the crown or it's stateside, the whole process of the doctrine of discovery, all the takings of the land, same thing. Next. We talked about the 4 elements and how these 4 elements are being abused. So we talked about fossil fuel, we talked about coal. From the Dene people, that's the lungs of the Mother Earth, eh? So we looked at things like that, the uranium that fuels the nuclear industry, oil, all that. Next. So we talked about all these, and I'm going to go on here. Next one. Talking about the foundations of who we are, and but part of this is our responsibility as speaking for the nature. Who speaks for the nature? We're dealing with the system that doesn't recognize their relationship with that sacredness of Mother Earth. And next. Next. So that was our mandate for our organization. It's not even an organization. It's a circle of elders and youth coming together to lift up our voices. That was the mandate they gave us, to present this declaration to the Conference of the Parties 4. That was the 4th Conference of the Parties. Paris was the 21st Conference of the Parties. This was the 4th one. To send this message to those world leaders coming together that have a spiritual foundation. Next. So this is the COP21, the issues. The issues on the right, a legally binding agreement. Number 2, a reduction of greenhouse gases, specifically the carbon dioxide. And then global warming limited to 2 degrees Celsius. Those were the 3 different pillars that they came together to work out. Next. Again, they have their own mandate. They have a different world. Their mandate started in 1994 to set a framework to take action aimed at stabilizing the atmosphere, the concentration of the greenhouse gases. That concentration of greenhouse gases is really a good language. Everything is accumulating, the concentration not only of carbon dioxide, but methane and other emissions. And to avoid dangerous, next one. To avoid this dangerous human-caused interference. There was a big debate. The industry said, well, it's not human-caused, it's the natural process of the planet, the volcanoes, and they tried to stay away from, actually the evidence was coming out that it's caused by humans, it's caused by tar sands type of development. Next. So 1991 to 96, those years was the world leaders had to take stock. They used that language, to take stock of how they implement and what their obligations are in their treaty. Treaty, that's where they use that word treaty. Not our treaty, it's their treaty. And the elder this morning was talking about the symbols. Their symbol is different for their treaties if we really look at it. It's removed from the earth. Next. So, I don't know, did you give me some more minutes? Okay, good. Good. So, the Kyoto Protocol is very important in this discussion to have an understanding of how you have some decisions to make, because we're going into a direction now to where you need to have this background, because they're talking of numbers and you need to have this information. It's not just about getting money to have solar energy. Just jump from this to solutions. Solutions is important, but there's some critical areas that we need to have our own critical analysis of. So the Kyoto Protocol, back to their mandates, was to look at the stabilizing the atmospheric interference of the concentration of these toxic gases that are causing climate change. So they got together as there's a requirement that the industrialized nations known as Annex 1, the northern US, European Union, Japan, as the main contributors of the problem we're in, they're contributing most of the emissions. There was a discussion to have a treaty again that they have to sign on to, that to cut their emissions of these greenhouse gases by an average of about 5% for the period of 2008 to 2012, using 1990 levels. Down here, I put this note, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, comprised of scientists. They already had findings that the problem we're in is that we need at least 60% reduction, 60% reduction of these greenhouse gases to stabilize global warming. But the United States and Canada followed the United States and said, we're going to cut 5%, 5%. So already as indigenous peoples, we're saying, what's wrong with this picture? So we start to advocate stronger positions. Next. Oh, back, this one back. This Kyoto Protocol also introduced what's called market mechanism, carbon market mechanisms. And me, I had to read that upside down and backwards just to start to understand everything, but specifically this market mechanism. It introduced emissions trading, cap and trade, clean development mechanisms, flexible mechanisms, on how they're using the market. So actually, if you're a polluter, you don't really need to pollute. You can actually buy a piece of paper that represents a carbon credit to protect trees, conserve trees in the global south where those credits are cheaper. So you look good when you run an ad in National Geographic that you have cut your emissions, that you have balanced your carbon footprint, that you have gone carbon neutral. And the way you've done that is that you haven't cut emissions at the source, like the tar sands. Some of those companies are participating in these carbon markets. They say we are working towards carbon neutrality, reducing our carbon footprint because we are investing in the conservation of trees in Brazil, in Ecuador, in South Africa. And that, isn't this good, Tom Goldtooth? Why are you debating this? But we're starting to debate it because this is not a solution, especially for the people who still live in these communities. Next. The Kyoto Protocol. It was a treaty that expires in 2012. So these world leaders, they're very systematic in that way. They got to think ahead. So they started a roadmap in Bali on how they're going to start a new treaty once this Kyoto Protocol, is called the First Commitment, ends in 2012. There was a big debate, again a big debate, because the Annex 1 countries like US, they never signed on to this treaty, by the way. They don't want to be held responsible under a treaty agreement to reduce their emissions. That's what the Kyoto Protocol was established for, a commitment, a binding commitment. Canada signed on to it, but they never complied to it. And the tar sands is one of the reasons why they never would fulfill the treaty agreement of the Kyoto Protocol, because of the tar sands. So the debate was really a lot of debate in these meetings. This using forests as carbon sequestration that was mentioned, bringing that in, called RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. It was entered into the whole Kyoto Protocol in Bali. And then this all ended up where all hell broke loose in 2009 in Copenhagen. Some of you probably were there. What's his name? Dene from AFN, representative for the Dene. Bill Erasmus was there. Some other people were there. Next. There was no agreement in Cancun. U.S. came in and just disturbed everything. They just disturbed everything. Obama came in. He made a deal with China. China is making deals with Canada, especially around Crown Land. I want to come back to that real quick. But Cancun, nothing, no agreement in Copenhagen. Everything fell apart. We had one friend, one government that was our friend as indigenous people. That was an indigenous leader called Evo Morales in Bolivia. And at that time, he was pushing Bolivia, pushing the Latin countries on these hard positions of emissions reduction. He rejected the carbon mechanism as a false solution. In fact, their negotiator from their friendly country, Venezuela, was trying to speak at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the chair was not recognizing her. This is how tense these negotiations were. She cut her hand by banging that aluminum plaque that said Venezuela, and blood was coming out of her hand, just to get recognition. So Cancun was a moment of building what we call indigenous resistance, not just with us, but also other communities, vulnerable communities, people of color communities in the United States, globally, the global South, beginning to merge with social movements. Historically, social movements are here and indigenous rights movements are here. Sometimes we don't get into each other's space, but this was starting to see where we have political power together around a narrative of rejecting false solutions. Kyoto Protocol had become a failure. Carbon market systems, red was the pillar, so we had to develop strategy. Next one. Cochabamba was a gathering called by Evo Morales. And that document, a lot of us need to know what that document is. Some of you were there too in this room. But also that elevated a new paradigm. Because as we fight these as indigenous peoples, we're dealing with a system that doesn't understand its relationship to the sacredness of Mother Earth. So it's a system in the world pushed by US, pushed by globalization, of privatization of land, of crops, of seeds, of life. Okay. So, next. So that World Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth. And that's one of the things we're trying to advocate and beginning to have a discussion with Chief and Consul, is a new paradigm that challenges the property rights regime that recognizes Earth jurisprudence, what we've always said. Who speaks for Mother Earth? Who speaks for the water? Their system doesn't want to do that. So, next. This is just some things coming out of that. Roadmap, kind of kicking the can down the road, the world leaders from Cancun 2010 all the way to Warsaw, Poland in 2014. Next slide. Paris Agreement. Is it a legally binding agreement? No. Next. Does the agreement call for immediate, urgent, and drastic emission reduction to shift us away from dirty energy? No. Next. The emissions cuts contained in the agreement are voluntary, called intended national determined contributions. Canada submitted theirs, US submitted theirs. There's a report that looked at all these INDCs, and that right now, if we stick with those, There's no indication that they're going to change. We're not going to go to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're not going to go to 2 degrees. It's going to get us into almost the 3 to 4 degrees Celsius area. That's going to be devastating. Devastating. Next. So the Paris Agreement said they aim to keep it below 2 degrees, and they mentioned kind of like an inspiration of 1.5, but it's not legally binding. Sounds good when it came out of Canada, 1.5. We're saying, wow, man, we got to be positive. In me, for all these years I've been involved, it's hot air. Next. So, in order to have a chance of reaching that 1.5, we need to keep at least 80% of the known fossil fuels in the ground. That's part of our narrative. And we need to halt the exploration and extraction of new sources. We need to stop deforestation and reduce other greenhouse gases such as methane. Paris Agreement has no mention of the words fossil fuels in it. No mention. Next. I'm wrapping it up. Paris Agreement comes into force in 2020. So what's going to happen between now and 2020? Nothing. It's just a free ride for business as usual. And it makes it almost impossible to reach that 2 degrees. Next. Canada looked good with the... I took this from Maud Barlow, National Chairperson, Council Canadian. She says, in reference to Canada, the goals without actions to back them are just more hot air. Next. And then she said, this, Andrea Donahue said, if Canada was serious about achieving this, that they must not approve these pipeline projects. It mentions them here. And even the tar sands, the numbers. Tar sands is already destined to expand. It's not going to fulfill that. Next. So, final 3 slides. What are the options? Is the options low on mitigation in Canada? Need to steady that word. And then more on adaptation, and that's going to create more suffering. Next. Is it moderate steps, business as usual scenario, mitigation, adaptation, suffering? Next. Or is it to put more beef, to put more support? And this is where Chief and Consul need to push mitigation. Because they're easy to say, no, don't challenge us on mitigation. We'll give you money to adapt. We'll give you some green money for solar. Don't you want solar? And so they'll skip mitigation because that's going to get political. They may cut off your Indian funding if you raise the bar on this issue. It's that challenging. It's a systems issue. Adaptation, but mitigation, then adaptation, and then less suffering. Next. So the North. It is true, the North has all this political pressure with everything on the small ecological space of the Earth, and the South is getting dumped on. So thank you very much.